They left a female officer and her K9 for the rising tide, unaware a Navy SEAL was watching. The ocean did not rage all at once. It crept in quietly, wave by wave, as if deciding how much mercy it would offer before taking everything. The first surge wrapped around the officer's boots, cold and sharp like a warning. The second climbed higher, pulling at her balance. By the third, the ropes cutting into her wrists had already gone numb, and the iron anchor behind her groaned as the tide claimed it inch by inch. She lifted her head toward the darkening sky, rain mixing with salt and blood on her face, knowing this was how they planned for it to end, not with a bullet, not with a trial, but with silence and water. Beside her, her K9 stayed pressed close, muscles tense, eyes fierce, refusing to abandon her even as the sea tried to separate them. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet courage of those who protect others, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel. Stories like this matter because they remind us what humanity looks like when everything else has been stripped away. She had been a police officer for years, the kind who chose night shifts and coastal patrols because fewer people wanted them. The shoreline was beautiful during the day, but after sunset it became a place where crimes washed in and out with the tide. Smuggling, corruption, secrets hidden under rocks and in coves no one mapped. She knew the risks when she followed the lead that night, trusting her instincts and the steady presence of her K9 partner. The dog had been trained for chaos, for crowds and explosions, but most of all for loyalty. He had learned her heartbeat, her breathing, the subtle changes in her posture when something felt wrong. That night, everything in him had screamed danger long before it arrived. The trap had been simple, almost lazy, which made it effective. A call about suspicious activity near the cliffs, a report of injured wildlife used as bait. She had responded alone because backup was stretched thin and the weather was already turning ugly. By the time she realized she was surrounded, the storm clouds had swallowed the moon and the sea below roared loud enough to drown out any call for help. They came from the shadows, faces hidden, voices calm and practiced. They disarmed her, restrained her, and dragged both her and the dog across wet stone toward the rusted anchor half buried at the waterline. It was old, massive, and heavy enough to outlast any struggle once the tide rose. They did not rush. They tied the knots carefully, looping rope around her torso and arms, binding her to the anchor as if securing cargo. They bound the dog close enough that she could feel his warmth and hear his breathing, but not close enough for him to break free. It was cruelty designed to break the spirit first. When they finally left, their footsteps faded into the storm, and the only sounds left were wind, rain, and the slow, inevitable approach of the sea. Pain came in waves just like the water. Her shoulders burned where the rope bit into flesh, and her legs shook from the cold. She forced herself to breathe slowly, not for herself alone, but for the dog pressed against her side. Panic would only make him panic. She leaned her head slightly toward him, grounding herself in the familiar smell of wet fur and salt. She had trained him to stay calm under fire, and now she had to live by the same discipline. She tested the ropes, small movements at first, but the knots held firm. The anchor did not budge. The tide reached her knees, then her waist, each surge stealing more warmth from her body. What she did not know was that the shoreline was not as empty as it seemed. Far above, among the jagged rocks where land met sky, a man watched through sheets of rain. He had not come there looking for heroism. He was a Navy SEAL on leave, carrying the weight of missions that never made the news and losses that never made headlines. The ocean had always been his way of remembering and forgetting at the same time. That night, something about the movement below caught his trained eye, a shape that did not belong, a pattern of struggle where there should have been none. Years of training sharpened his focus instantly. He recognized the posture of restraint, the unnatural stillness of someone fighting panic with discipline. He saw the dog first, then the uniform, then the ropes. His jaw tightened as understanding settled in. He did not hesitate, because hesitation was a luxury people tied to anchors did not have. He moved fast but silent, navigating the rocks with the ease of someone who had done harder things in worse conditions. The storm worked in his favor, hiding his approach, masking the sound of his boots and breath. Down below, the water reached the officer's chest. Each wave lifted her slightly, then slammed her back against the anchor. Her strength faded, replaced by a heavy, creeping numbness. She thought of unfinished reports, of her mother who worried every time she worked late, of the dog who had chosen her again and again without question. She refused to let despair win, even as her vision blurred. She focused on staying upright, on keeping her head above water for just one more wave, then another. The seal reached the lower rocks as a surge crashed hard enough to nearly submerge them both. He waited for the rhythm of the tide, timing his descent with precision. When he finally moved, it was like the ocean itself had decided to intervene. He slid into the shallows, muscles burning against the cold, eyes locked on the ropes. The dog sensed him first, a low rumble in his chest turning into alert focus rather than fear. The officer felt a shift beside her, something different in the air, but exhaustion made it hard to hope. The first cut of the knife was clean and deliberate. Rope fibers snapped under the blade, and the officer gasped as pressure eased from her arms. The seal worked quickly, methodically, freeing her torso first, then turning to the dog. Another wave crashed over them, but he braced himself, shielding them both with his body. Years of combat training condensed into seconds of pure instinct. The anchor remained, claimed by the sea, but the people bound to it did not. When the last rope fell away, the officer nearly collapsed. The seal caught her, steadying her as she fought to stand. There were no words exchanged, no time for explanations. He guided her toward higher ground, one step at a time. The dog pressed close, growling at the darkness as if daring it to try again. The climb was brutal, rocks slick with rain, muscles screaming in protest, but survival sharpened every movement. Together, they reached the cliffs just as the tide swallowed the place where the anchor had been. Up above, the storm began to lose its edge. The rain softened, the wind eased, and the sky lightened just enough to suggest dawn was on its way. The officer sat hunched against a rock, wrapped in the seal's jacket, shaking not just from cold but from the release of terror held too long. The dog leaned into her, steady and warm, his presence anchoring her now. The seal stood watch, scanning the shoreline until he was satisfied no one else would come. As the adrenaline faded, emotion rushed in to fill the space it left behind. The officer understood how close she had come to disappearing without a trace, becoming just another story the ocean kept. She also understood that someone had seen her when it mattered most, not because it was his job, not because anyone would reward him, but because he could not look away. The seal, for his part, felt something loosen inside him too, a reminder that even after all the darkness he had witnessed, there were still lives he could pull back from the edge. Rescue teams arrived later, guided by a signal sent once hands stopped shaking enough to use a radio. Questions followed, reports were filed, and investigations began, but those details blurred together. What stayed sharp was the memory of water climbing higher, of a knife flashing in the storm, of breath returning when it felt impossible. The officer returned to duty after healing, carrying scars that did not always show. The dog stayed at her side, more alert than ever, their bond forged deeper by shared survival. The seal did not stay. He never waited for thanks or recognition. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, he was already gone, leaving behind only footprints that the tide soon erased. But his presence lingered in ways that mattered, in the officer's renewed resolve to keep doing the job despite the fear, in the dog's unwavering trust, in the quiet knowledge that even in the worst moments someone might be watching, ready to act. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the courage hidden in ordinary uniforms and the extraordinary loyalty of those who stand beside them, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. And before the ending, we have a special request for you. Comment below with your thoughts or a simple message of respect for the officer, her K9, and the unseen heroes who step in when time is running out. Because the ocean will always rise, storms will always come, and darkness will always test us. But as long as there are people willing to watch, to notice, and to move toward danger instead of away from it, hope will keep finding a way back to shore.